We are continuing in our series that we began for this season of Lent. And we've been talking about the things that we will not give up on Lent, as opposed to the things that people say they're going to give up on Lent. The non-negotiables, the ones that we just cannot do without. And today we're going to talk about a very complicated, although it wouldn't seem to be so, very kind of complicated subject called faith. I want to take us back before we jump into the text a little bit. If you go back to probably what is the most magnificent part of a letter that Paul ever penned, 1 Corinthians 13. Raise your hand if you're familiar with that. 1 Corinthians 13. Well, the rest of y'all have never read 1 Corinthians 13? Just don't want to raise your hands. Whatever. Anyway, if you kind of recall, if you've read that and you recall, Paul lays out all of these things about love, and at the very end of it, he kind of concludes it by saying, but these three things remain. Meaning these three things persist, these three things endure, these three things continue, these three things thrive. And the three things he's talking about are faith, hope, and love. Doesn't sound too remarkable, except for the fact if you go back up to the top of where he started his argument, and he makes a rather radical statement. He says that prophecies will cease, tongues will be stilled, and knowledge will pass away. That's an amazing confession. What he's saying is the practice and the results of the spiritual gifts are going to end. They have a limited shelf life. You know when you get anything from the dairy section in the grocery store, it says best used by. That's kind of what Paul's saying about these spiritual gifts. There's going to be a time when they will no longer be needed. That's going to happen when Jesus returns. And if you read towards the end of the Bible, you get this wonderful picture of God just dwelling among us. And so at that point, there won't really be a need for the gift of tongues or the interpretation of tongues, will there? No. There won't be a need for prophecies because the prophecies have been fulfilled. There won't be a need for healing because we'll all be whole. I mean, that's an astounding thing if you think about it. And yet, the other part of what Paul is saying is even more outstanding. While there's a limited shelf life for the spiritual gifts, there is an absolutely unlimited shelf life for faith, hope, and love. There will always be a need for faith and hope and love. Now, when we talk about faith, what do we really mean? Now, faith is literally a belief in something, but it's also a trust in someone. It's both from a biblical perspective. It's not one or the other. That's why the author in Hebrews, when he's getting ready to do this, it's the 11th chapter, although they want chapters for the author, but when he's getting ready to do and lay out this stream of the heroes and the heroines of faith, he says faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. I mean, it's one thing to believe in like a concept or a principle or a law. Because there's a sort of a premise. And then and that theorem of that premise is proven true, then it's okay. You can just make a mental assent with that one. You know it's true. You know it's right. But it's something else to have trust in someone. Because we don't have control over other people. And trusting them is hard for all of us. And if we recall, you go back to Exodus in the Israelites, when God moves them out with a mighty hand out of Egypt with Moses, those Israelites believed in God. They believed in the concept of God. They believed in the existence of God. But they did not trust God, did they? They did not trust God. See, that generation is referred to in Hebrews as a people who never rested in the Lord. In fact, the author of Hebrews puts it this way. Let's go back there for just a second. In chapter 9, chapter 11, verse 9, he writes these words: "There remains, therefore, a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their own work, just as God did his." And we know that when God created everything, in a span of time, God finished all that and then rested. All that work, all that creating endeavors that God did, God rested from that. There's a partnership with us and God. We do our part. When we've done all that we can do, then we rest. There's a part that God does. When God does all that God can do, God rests. Trusts, ceases from labors. Those people that came out with Moses had difficulty resting or trusting in God. They saw all the plagues that God had done to the Egyptians. It was amazing. There were some of those plagues where it would rain hail all over Egypt, except where the people of God were. All the damage was done, but not where the people of God were. And then they ended up receiving God's protection, if you will, for the last and final plague, which they just took blood from a Passover lamb and marked the lintel and the side posts, and death passed over them. But for the Egyptians, death did not pass over, and the firstborn and all of their homes died. When they left Egypt, the Scripture tells us that the Egyptians the Israelites had so much favor in the eyes of the Egyptians that they just gave them all these valuable commodities and goods, clothes, silver, gold. They saw the sea part. They walked on dry land. When it looked like they were going to be snuffed out by all the soldiers that were coming across, they watched the sea roll back in and destroy all their enemies. And yet 3 days later, just 3 days later, they are screaming at Moses because they believe God has drugged them out to the desert to kill them from lack of water. They're going to die from thirst. And then they see water manifested out of a rock. Then they think they're going to starve to death. And God rains down manna to be picked up fresh every morning. And then when they complain they don't have any meat, God blows this west wind in. It's never blown in that direction before. And the quail are blown from an area where they are to an area where they have never been before, 3 feet deep, all around their camp. It's like the shampoo bottle we have in our showers. Rinse, wash, repeat. Over and over and over again. The Israelites are constantly in this emotional laboring of worry and anxiety and doubt, and then complaining because they can't see God's hand at work in their next need. They believed in God, but they did not trust God. They did not rest in a peaceful reliance, knowing they'd done all they could do. Now God was going to do all that He could in God's time. The track record for God answering their prayers on a percentage basis, 100%. It just didn't always come in the form and in the time that the Israelites expected it. That's easy to kick them in the shins, isn't it? When they ask, are we any better? Are we any better? I mean, no Christian here is ever going to admit, I don't believe in God. No, we all believe in God, don't we? We believe in the concept of God. We believe in the personhood of God. And if we ask, do you trust God? We don't go, oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, hiddenness of God's delay, in the absence of a healing, when it seems like the opportunity that you've prayed for 1,000 times is not going to happen, are you resting in the Lord? A great example of what I'm talking about comes when Paul writes to his beloved Timothy. And when he writes the letter, he's in a political prison. He's in a political prison because he's really done some awful things. He started churches, and he's taught and preached that Jesus is Lord. He writes to Timothy, he says, that's why I'm suffering as I am. Yet I'm not ashamed, because I know in whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him for that day. I am convinced he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him. Are you convinced that God is able to guard what you've entrusted to him? Even when you haven't seen it? It would have been so easy for Paul to have complained and whined. It's so unfair. All I've done is just serve God and just risk my faith for God. And look what it's got me. I'm in a political prison here. Why is this happening to me? Why me? Or he could have written Timothy and he said, where are you? Why do you keep delaying? I'm all alone here and by myself. I need you. Or he could have said, I'm hungry and cold. I can't sleep in this place. I'm wasting away. None of that. What he says is, I know in whom I have believed. I'm convinced what I've entrusted to him, he will keep. See, being assured and convinced of something that you have already received and that you hold in your hands, that's not much conviction and assurance, is it? But when you haven't received a desire, when you're waiting in these long, long delays of something that you need but it hasn't come, or if you're sitting right down smack dab in the middle of some terrible injustice that's being done to you or to your family, and then you have assurance and conviction, now that's a Sabbath rest right there. That's a Sabbath rest. Let's get to our story. Peter, James, and John and Jesus come down off a mountain. And man, have they had an elevated spiritual experience. They have seen Jesus in a transformed state that we call the transfiguration. It's literally the glorification of Jesus in his deity. The glory of Jesus is shining so bright they can barely look at him. He is luminous, radiant. And he's talking to Elijah and Moses. And if that wasn't enough, then the Father speaks to them. This is my Son. Listen to him. That's an experience they would never forget as long as they live. And then in kind of a metaphorical way, they come down off the mountain. And then they come down to where there's all this chaos and shouting. And there's this botched healing that's going on. And the father of this epileptic child, whose son literally throws himself in the fire sometimes or throws himself in the water sometimes, comes down to Jesus and bows and kneels down in Jesus in his submission to Jesus. And you can just hear the sadness in his voice. He says, I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And it's like Jesus in this one moment has a kind of a really human kind of a moment. We've all been there. It's like he's just maxed out with his frustration. And he's not just speaking to disciples, and he's not speaking to Israelites. I think he's speaking to human beings in general. And he says, "Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." The text tells us that he rebuked the demon. Up until that point, had there been any mention of a need for a spiritual deliverance? No, not a word. But when the demon is cast out, the boy is healed. If you're like me, I got a lot of questions. All kinds of questions. So do the disciples. And it's almost a revelation what they ask. Why could we not drive it out? Let me tell you a story. Second appointment I had, one of the churches I had was Iola United Methodist. And between our two churches, we had a huge youth group. We had 5. One of them was my daughter. And then we had a brother, sister, and 2 sisters. And Matthew and Tammy were the brother and sister. And then Jessica and Andrea were the other 2 sisters. And there was my daughter. And Matthew was the one boy in there. And I thought, that kid's the luckiest man on the face of the earth, surrounded by all these beautiful young girls. And Tammy was always kind of special to me. Tammy, she was a tomboy, kind of. She was tall, pretty athletic, and she was always poking fun at me. And we just, kidded each other back and forth all the time. Got a call from her parents one day that she'd had a seizure at school. And they were going to take her and have her examined. And about 10 days or so after that, I was up in the pulpit. You got to realize this is a really small church, really small. And I'm preaching, and she was on the 3rd row, right in front of the pulpit. And I'm preaching, and all of a sudden, she went into a seizure. Can I just tell you that they don't teach you about that in seminary? And I'm like, and everybody's staring, it's like this, and she's thrashing around, and there was a carpet down the middle, but everything else was wood. It's just radiating off the walls. Bang, banging, banging. I was like frozen. I was like, and an older gentleman who was kind of like our lay leader, Bob Sloan, since joined to be with the Lord, came up and he just said, "We need to pray." And I said, yeah, we need to pray. And we got down there and he started praying, and I asked everybody to come here. Let's just lay hands on her and let's just start praying for her. And I don't guess there was ever a finer moment in that church's history when we just prayed. And as we're praying, I can just hear that foot just banging and banging and banging against that pew. I said, what else can we do? Finally, she was still, and they were able to get her up and walk her out. The next few weeks, we had this telephone line on our church, and we called, and we prayed. We prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed. We were just like those disciples. We were just as clueless as they were. Jesus answered that question. Why couldn't we cast it out? He says, then you have so little faith. And then he turns right around and talks about faith the size of a mustard seed. If you had just that much, you could move a mountain. I don't know, I guess it just got to the point when, with Tammy in our church, and all the prayers and people praying, we just reached a point where we just kind of came to the end of us. There wasn't anything else we could do. And that's when the strangest thing happened. Somebody that they didn't really know, who heard from somebody that they didn't know, who heard from somebody that they did know, called Tammy's mother and said, "Have you heard about this homeopathic doctor in Asheville? Older gentleman, long since retired." I remember she called me and she said, "I don't know what else to do. I'm going to try this." I said, "Sure. Maybe this will be the answer." The doctor examined her and checked her out, and he prescribed this really different kind of diet for her. And the seizures stopped. She went back to school. She graduated. She got married, and she now has 3 children. She has her own business. She is doing just really, really well. Now, I guess I'm always going to have some questions about this text that Gigi read. I know we all believe in God. Do we trust God? Do we trust God when things are delayed or denied, unanswered? Will we rest in God then? I mean, if a mustard seed, as tiny as it is, could grow into a tree over 20 feet tall, what could our faith? What could our trust? What could our resting in the Lord grow into? I don't know. But it makes me never want to give